The night she arrived at the edge of Eli Carter's land, the wind was not merely cold, it was cruel, slicing across the open plains with the kind of force that strips a person down to whatever strength they truly possess. And Clara knew, as she stood there gripping the frayed edges of her coat, that she was standing at the final margin between endurance and collapse, between continuing forward and simply letting the dark take her. Because everything she once believed made life stable, work, shelter, promises, people, had unraveled one by one, until all that remained was the long road behind her and a single, dimly lit ranch house ahead, glowing faintly like a test she wasn't sure she could pass. While inside that house lived a man who had built his life around silence after grief, taught him that caring too deeply was a liability, not a virtue, and Eli Carter had not opened his door to a stranger in 15 years, not since the day the world took his wife and left him with memories too sharp to hold. So when he noticed a figure standing just beyond the reach of his lantern light, he did what he always did when something threatened to disturb the careful order of his solitude. He hesitated, hoping it would disappear on its own. But Clara did not disappear. She stood her ground, shoulders squared against the wind, not because she was brave, but because she had run out of places to retreat. And when Eli finally opened the door, the warm light spilling onto the frozen dirt between them, their eyes met in a moment that neither of them would ever be able to fully explain. Because recognition does not always come from familiarity. Sometimes it comes from shared absence, from understanding what it means to lose more than you can replace. And Clara spoke first, her voice quiet but steady, apologizing for existing in his space, explaining she had been told this was the only ranch for miles, asking, without asking, for nothing more than a chance to survive the night. And Eli, who had rehearsed 100 reasons over the years to keep people out, found every one of them collapsing, under the simple fact that this woman was not asking for charity, she was asking for mercy. And mercy, unlike kindness, does not demand comfort from the giver, so he stepped aside, letting her cross the threshold, unaware that the moment she did, the invisible walls he had built around his life cracked for the first time since grief had hardened them. And inside the house the fire was low but alive, just enough to take the edge off the cold, just enough to remind Clara what warmth felt like. And Eli offered soup without ceremony, water without conversation, allowing silence to do the work that words could not. Because some people heal not by speaking, but by being allowed to exist without explanation. And hours passed in that quiet, understanding until the fire burned down to embers and the weight of night pressed heavy against the windows. And it was then, when vulnerability has nowhere left to hide, that Clara asked the question that would alter the course of both their lives. Her voice barely louder than the wind outside as she said, "Where will I sleep?" And to her it was a practical concern, a matter of logistics. But to Eli it was an unexpected reckoning, because the answer required him to open a room he had sealed away not out of neglect but survival, a room that held the last physical proof of the life he once planned to grow old inside. And for a moment he stood frozen, caught between the man he had become and the man he used to be, before turning down the narrow hallway toward the closed door at the end, each step heavier than the last, because behind that door waited the bed that had been empty for 15 years and the quilt folded carefully at its foot, the quilt his wife had sewn during her final winter, every stitch made with hands that believed in a future she would never see. And when Eli reached the door, his hand hovered over the knob, the past pressing against him with relentless force. But instead of turning away, he opened it, letting dust and memory rise together. And with deliberate care, he pulled back the blanket, straightened the sheets and lifted the quilt, its faded colors still carrying the quiet echo of love. And when he returned to Clara and said simply, "You'll sleep there. It's warm," something inside her broke, not because she was weak, but because strength cannot survive forever without relief. And she followed him down the hall, stopping at the doorway as tears filled her eyes. not over the bed itself, but over what it represented, because no one had given her something, without taking something in return for so long that she had forgotten such moments existed. And that night, as Clara lay beneath the weight of that quilt, warmth seeping into her bones and safety settling into her breath, she cried silently into the pillow, mourning the life she had lost and welcoming the possibility of a life she might still build. While Eli sat alone at the kitchen table long after the house had gone quiet, staring into his cold cup of coffee, realizing too late that by pulling back that blanket, he had uncovered parts of himself he had buried alongside his grief, and neither of them knew it yet. But that single question, where would she sleep, had rewritten the new direction of two broken lives that had not been looking for salvation, only a reason to keep going. Morning arrived not with urgency, but with a cautious softness, as if the land itself were unsure whether it was allowed to disturb what had quietly begun during the night. And when pale sunlight slipped through the thin curtains of the spare room, Clara woke slowly, disoriented at first by the unfamiliar ceiling above her, and then overwhelmed by the unfamiliar sensation of safety, a feeling so rare in her recent life that her body did not immediately trust it. And she lay still for several minutes beneath the quilt, listening to the distant sounds of the ranch waking up, the low huff of horses in the stable, the creak of old wood adjusting to warmth, the muted rhythm of boots moving across the floor somewhere down the hall. And she realized that she had slept through the night without jolting awake in fear, without counting exits, without bracing for the moment someone would tell her it was time to leave. And that realization alone was enough to make her eyes burn with tears she refused to let fall just yet, because gratitude, she had learned, was safest when kept quiet. And when she finally rose and folded the quilt carefully, instinctively, as if honoring something sacred, she stepped into the kitchen where Eli stood at the counter pouring coffee, his movements deliberate, restrained, as though he were afraid that acknowledging her presence too directly might shatter whatever fragile balance had formed. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because some mornings do not require introductions. They require acceptance, and Eli simply gestured toward the table, setting down a plate of eggs and bread without asking if she was hungry, because he already knew the answer. And as Clara ate, she noticed the way he avoided the hallway that led to the room she had slept in, the way his gaze lingered briefly on the empty chair across from her before settling elsewhere. And she understood then that kindness does not come without cost, that the generosity he had offered her had asked something of him in return, even if he never voiced it. And when she finally thanked him, the words trembling despite her effort to keep them steady, Eli only nodded once and said, "Weather's turning. You can stay until it doesn't," a sentence that sounded temporary, but carried the weight of something more permissive beneath it. And so Clara stayed, first through the day, then the next night, then another, helping where she could, learning the rhythm of the ranch, the way one learns a language not by studying it but by living inside it. And Eli watched her from a careful distance, noting how she moved with quiet determination, how she never complained, how she treated the animals not as tools but as companions. And slowly, almost against his will, the ranch began to feel less like a place he was surviving inside, and more like a place that was breathing again. Because Clara brought with her a presence that did not demand conversation, but invited it. And over time, fragments of their histories surfaced naturally, not as confessions but as shared understanding. Clara speaking of the city that had swallowed her whole, of employers who promised loyalty until profit demanded otherwise, of friends who disappeared when her usefulness expired, and Eli speaking, rarely, carefully, of a love that had once filled this land with laughter, of plans interrupted by illness, of a silence that had seemed easier than learning how to live again. And as weeks passed, winter loosened its grip, the ground softening, the air warming, and Clara grew stronger, not just physically but in the way she held herself, as though the ranch were returning to her a version of herself she thought had been lost forever. And one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun sink low across the fields. She told him the truth she had been carrying since that first night, that when she had asked where she would sleep, she had already accepted that the answer might be nowhere, that she had prepared herself to walk back into the dark if she had to, and Eli listened without interrupting, because by then he understood that sometimes survival hinges on a single yes, a single moment when someone decides you are worth the risk. And in the quiet that followed, Clara admitted she had begun writing again, documenting not just what had happened to her, but what she was learning about resilience, about the unseen impact of small mercies, about how lives intersect in moments that never make headlines but change everything. And she spoke of wanting those stories to reach others, people standing in their own darkness, wondering if kindness still existed, people who needed reminders that humanity survives in quiet places. And Eli, who had never cared much for being seen or remembered, found himself agreeing, understanding that stories like theirs only endure when someone chooses to listen, when someone chooses to pass them forward rather than letting them fade into silence. And when spring finally arrived in earnest, Clara knew it was time to leave, not because she was being asked to, but because she no longer needed to stay to survive. And on the morning, she packed her small bag, folding the quilt one last time before placing it carefully inside. Eli stood by the door, his expression unreadable, and she told him she would return it someday, that she would carry what it represented into everything she built next. And he simply said, it was always meant to keep someone warm. And as she walked down the dirt road away from the ranch, she did not look back, not out of indifference, but out of certainty, because some places do not need to be revisited to remain part of who you are. And Eli watched until she disappeared beyond the horizon, then returned to his house, closing the door gently behind him, but not locking it, because he understood now that solitude chosen is different from solitude imposed, and that the night a stranger asked where she would sleep, the answer he gave had not just saved her, it had quietly, irrevocably given his life back its meaning.